Welcome to the INFOWARS Nightly News. I'm your host, Jakari Jackson. It's September 11th, 2014. And let's get straight into our news tonight. ISIS threat to America, a farce. Now, let me be very clear when I bring up this article. I'm not saying that ISIS doesn't exist. ISIS is a very real threat. They do have real extremists out there killing people on foreign soil, making threats to us here in the United States of America. So yes, they are real, and they are definitely an imminent threat. Now, with that said, the article points out, as I would like to point out to you, is that ISIS is a manufactured threat. It's controlled opposition. And let's take this example. You guys probably heard the old anecdote about the guy who lived in New York years ago, and he'd run around with a hammer and bust out people's windshields, their side mirrors or whatever. But he'd always do this right under a big sign that said, Bob's Auto Repair, or whatever the guy's name was. It just so happened that Bob, the guy with the hammer, owned the auto repair shop. So he'd bust out your window, you look up, oh, Bob has an auto repair shop. Let me go see what he's doing. That's what the U.S. government is doing. We have ISIS, we have Al-Qaeda. We have Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Syria. They break off, they merge together to form ISIS. But keep in mind, we're funding and will continue to fund Syrian rebels in Syria, most of which who aren't even really Syrian. So we have we're running around busting people's windows with Al-Qaeda, and now we have the auto repair shop being the U.S. military to go in there and clean up the problem. And that's what's happening in the United States of America. That's what our foreign policy has degraded to. Now let's hear what Obama had to say about this very important issue.
But I want the American people to understand how this effort will be different from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil.
And you heard him say there, it will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. Well, that is in direct contradiction to what an NBC reporter put out. He says boots are already on the ground in Iraq. And this is NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engdahl, who says boots are already on the ground in Iraq. He says, I know there are already American boots on the ground where I am now, Engdahl told MSNBC News. And he's saying that the troops out there are doing everything possible to avoid the American cameras because you can't have troops on camera in a foreign land when Obama just said, no, there are not going to be any boots on the ground. It's a complete lie, a complete farce. And this is, like I said, this is what this administration has come to. And I'm not saying Bush is a angel or, Clinton was a sweetie cake, but it's a lot of, just fallacies in the way these guys handle the country. Now let's move on to something else ISIS related. There's this picture floating around the internet, maybe you guys have seen it, and it claims to show an ISIS militant with an apparent U.S. Army tattoo. Now I took the Photoshop challenge and I zoomed in on this image as far as I could go. As you can see from the image, it's already kind of pixelated. So I zoomed in and I found out that it's definitely not the image that you see to the right of the gentleman. It's not the clear picture that you see there. So you zoom in all the way in using Photoshop or whatever you have, and you find out it's a very similar logo. It looks to me kind of more like the Punisher logo, that Black Skull logo, than the one to the right. But when I zoomed in on it, I could not make out what the text said in the tattoo. So could it potentially be a U.S. Army tattoo? Yes, that is potentially what it could be. But the skull, to me, looked to be different, and I also cannot read the text at all. So if you guys have a clearer image of this, you can send that to infowars.com/show. And something that the people in San Diego need is a clearer picture of militarization of the police, because we see the schools in San Diego are now being given MRAPs, the military mine-resistant vehicles. And this is in Wake. This is post-Ferguson, Missouri. I was there, many of the INFOWARS crew were there, and we saw the big MRAP vehicles, the guys in the heavy armor, the guys on top of the MRAPs, aiming snipers at people, putting sniper dots on their chest. We've shown you those things. The curfew, the tear gas, the rubber bullets, so Joe Biggs got shot by one, all the craziness that went on out there in Ferguson, Missouri. And after that, your police departments, your sheriff's departments, they started to discuss, or at least publicly to, put a happy face on things. Do we really need all these things in our neighborhoods? And so now, when some departments are saying, hey, we'll get rid of some of these things, Pentagon, come pick these things up. Now you have one of these things going to a school in San Diego, and this is the San Diego Unified School District. Police are receiving mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, or at least one, as part of the federal government's program to hand down military equipment to domestic law enforcement. And they cite these shootings at Columbine for their actions on doing this. And I understand the need to protect your officers, but like I just said, this whole spectacle of force in Ferguson, Missouri had some people on edge, including myself. And, they use this for Columbine, And I'm sure that at places like Ohio State, where they also got these big military mine-resistant vehicles, they decide something like Virginia Tech, right? And I do understand you need some heavy armor, you need some rifles, trained rifle guys who can handle these situations from a distance, because you're not always in a situation where, your pistol or your shotgun will be effective. I understand that. And also with the armor, other things as well. But, I don't want this to be an all-purpose deal, just like we saw with Ferguson, Missouri. The Pentagon, at least on the faces, was saying, well, you guys aren't supposed to use this for, non-lethal situations where you're not engaged in an active shooter or something like that. You can't go out there and bully a crowd of protesters, just like they bullied a crowd of protesters at Berkeley. The guy comes out and pepper sprays everybody. You're not supposed to do those things. So at least on the surface, they're saying that they don't want these police departments and these sheriff's departments to act this way, but they're giving them the equipment to do it. So when I see things like San Diego or Ohio State, I'm very concerned as to why these guys think they need such weapons to combat a school population. Because it's not just the weapons, it's the training that these guys receive. And we see this story: cops brutalize teen girl over cell phone.
The video captures the screams of Ixel Perez. She's pinned to the hallway floor of Sam Houston High School. One officer handcuffing her, the other has his knee on her head.
It was embarrassing.
This is Perez today, all 4'10", 70 pounds of her. Outside the school, she says she will not attend anymore.
And the issue about this is that this type of thing is not an isolated incident. These aren't some road cops, some dirty, hairy types. The issue is that these guys are being trained like this, whether it's a 70-pound schoolgirl with a cell phone or whether it's a 6'6" guy with a machete. They're trained to do the same thing: get the guy on the ground, put a knee on their head or in their back. Like I did the story last week about the SWAT teams engaging some guy in a swatting prank, I guess you would call it. And I don't blame the SWAT team for responding to the issue, because you get a call, you don't know if it's true or not, so you got to send your boys in. I understand that. But they come in, they put a gun to the guy, get down on the ground, put a boot in the guy's back, stay down there, boy, and all this stuff. And they have no idea who this guy is. This thing could happen to you, whether you're in school or some other thing, you encounter a SWAT team or, some overly aggressive officers who have been trained to act that way. And then, they're asking you all the tough questions. Who are you? What are you doing here? And you have no idea why they're there, so you can't even answer their questions. And that's the problem with the militarization of the police, about the brutalization of the police. Not all police are bad, but you have to change these very bad policies. And it's September 11th, so we have to address the 9/11 attacks. And instead of regurgitating the talking points that you see in the mainstream media, I have a few hard-hitting questions and statements I'd like to make about September 11th before we go into more special reports. Now, let me be very clear. These things I'm going to bring up here, these aren't definitive. He did this or she did that. That's not what I'm getting into today. I just want people to think about these very basic, rudimentary things that do not get a whole lot of attention nowadays, 13 years later. Because I was watching the Alex Jones show earlier today in the Overdrive segment, and Leanne McAdoo was out there, and she said there are so many children out there who are either, not born or, they were too young to remember the attacks at the time that they happened. And they just believe the official story, hook, line, and sinker, no question about it. So I want to question some of these things here today. And like I'm saying, I'm not saying Dick Cheney blew up the Pentagon. I'm not saying George Bush blew up the Twin Towers with a plunger like Wile E. Coyote. I'm not saying that at all. I just think that the government could have did more to lessen the blow or even completely prevent the blows of September 11th. And let's start with that very point. It was reported by ABC News that NORAD ran drills on the exact scenario that happened on September 11th, 2001. And when I say the exact drill, I don't mean just an attack on the World Trade Center. I don't mean just a plane flying into the World Trade Center. I mean those things combined happening on September 11th.
There were people in the United States who actually were preparing to defend against the kind of attacks which occurred here on 9/11. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD for short, has been defending the skies over the U.S. and Canada for almost 50 years, 46 to be precise. USA Today reports that in the 2 years before the attacks on September the 11th, NORAD conducted exercises using hijacked airliners as weapons. And one target was the World Trade Center.
And you say, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Well, NORAD is the group that scrambles the jets to intercept the jets, so why wasn't anything intercepted? Now let's move on now to the Pentagon. And the Pentagon was a very questionable thing to me, because you think about the Twin Towers, right? So you've seen the Twin Towers from all different angles being hit by the planes, falling down, cameras on the ground, cameras up on top of other buildings and so forth. You've seen so many different angles. But with the Pentagon, you have one angle of not even footage of still images. I think it was, 8 still images that supposedly show, whatever hitting the Pentagon. And yes, I do believe the Pentagon was hit by something. But, when I think about a giant jumbo jet, go to an airport, look at a plane if you've never been on one yourself. But you think about how they say the entire plane was sucked into this hole, no wings on the outside of the Pentagon, no wing indentions. They say the entire thing was sucked into this hole in the Pentagon and completely vaporized by the intense heat. But regardless of all of that, the issue about the cameras, go to your local grocery store, go to the gas station, go to a mall, go to a movie theater, and count the number of cameras outside of that establishment. And now think about the Pentagon. Contrast this with the Pentagon, one of the most secure above-ground structures on planet Earth. And all they can do is produce one camera angle of still images of some object striking the Pentagon. That's very curious to me indeed. So that's not a conspiracy theory. That's what happened. You haven't seen any actual footage of that thing going into the Pentagon. And people will contrast that. They'll say, well, people saw, planes flying low through the city that day. I'm sure they did. But if I see a pack of wild dogs running down South Congress here in the city of Austin, Texas, and 10 minutes later somebody gets bit by a dog, that doesn't necessarily mean that the dogs that I saw bit the person down the street. Now, do you have probable cause to think it was the same dogs I saw? Sure. Do you have reasonable suspicion to think it was the same dogs that I saw? Sure, but you don't have definitive proof that the same dog that bit you was the dog I saw 10 minutes ago running around. That's something about the Pentagon. Now let's talk about Building 7. BBC reported that Building 7 collapsed before it ever collapsed.
Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off and evacuated, apart from the emergency workers. That was done by the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, much earlier today because of, of course, the dreadful collapse of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. But New York, very much a city still in chaos.
So we talked about the Pentagon, we talked about Building 7, now let's talk about the Twin Towers. And particularly William Rodriguez, who worked in the North Tower for over 20 years. He was saying he felt a huge explosion in the basement of the North Tower before the plane ever hit.
I worked in the building for 20 years. I was the person in charge of all the stairwells of the North Tower. And on 9/11, I had the only master key that opened the doors that rescue people. This is the master key. They call it the key of hope. And basically, I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement. And this is prior to the building got hit by the plane. And then the plane hit, and then there was a series of explosions afterwards. And a person comes running into the office saying, explosion, explosion, explosion.
And to my knowledge, there is no official explanation as to why the explosion happened in the basement of the North Tower. And people will say, well, what does it matter because a plane hit the top of the tower? It matters because a big-ass explosion happened in the basement before the plane hit. And how did that happen? What was going on that day? I would very much like to know. So if you want to know these things, you need to go to INFOWARS.com and also PrisonPlanet.tv. Get yourself a 15-day free trial. You can check out the Alex Jones Show, the nightly news, the special reports, the rants, and so much more at PrisonPlanet.tv. Now stay tuned, because after this break, Darren McBreen will have a special report about the 28 secret pages from the 9/11 report, and also we'll have continued coverage from our crew on the ground in Manhattan. This is the INFOWARS Nightly News.
Celebrate the spirit of freedom and liberty upon which our nation was founded at InfoWarsShop.com. Molon Lave is ancient Greek for come and take it. This popular design combines both classic Greek Spartan imagery with modern M16 assault rifles. Now available in women's tees and proudly made in the USA. Celebrate the spirit of 1776 with the George Washington brass belt buckle, or this incredibly sharp-looking 1776 hat. Badass. And be sure to check out the new arrivals at InfoWars Life, where you can prepare your body to perform at peak levels with Survival Shield, Nascent Iodine, Super Male Vitality, and Fluoride Shield. And wake up, America. Immune Support Blend is the healthy choice for the gourmet.